Nearly 1.6 million Americans are living with type 1 diabetes. That number is projected to hit 5 million by 2050. And the figures get worse on a global scale, where prevalence is 9.5% of the world population, or more than 750 million people. Despite these figures, the standard of care has been the same since the 20s, insulin. The good news is that therapeutic progress is being made, albeit a bit slowly, and biologics are playing a role. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's episode of the Business of Biotech, we're talking with a venture capital veteran who's leading the effort to direct more resources more quickly toward the development of curative therapies for type 1 diabetes. Katie Ellias is Managing Director of the JDRF T1D Fund, a venture philanthropy fund dedicated to creating a market in T1D by using capital and expertise that convince venture capital, biotech, and pharma to make the investments needed to cure T1D. On today's show, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of this unique and aggressive investment model, which Katie is well equipped to lead, and why it's modeled the leaders of emerging biotechs should be aware of. I'll let Katie share her industry experience and how it shaped her worldview, but for some flavor, she currently holds some board membership or observatory positions with no fewer than 8 biotechs. She previously directed investments at VC firms, including Endeavor Vision and Sofinnova Partners. She held marketing and biz dev leadership positions at Medtronic, and she was a McKinsey analyst, among other stops on her career journey. She's a Yale undergrad with a Wharton MBA in healthcare marketing. And on today's show, we're talking the business of type 1 diabetes and the opportunities she and her fund are creating for biopharma in a truly massive market. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you, and I hope I did you some justice by way of that introduction. I looked at your CV in my preparation, and I was like, well, I can't. We'd be on for 20 minutes, kind of rolling through all the stops on her career journey thus far. So we're going to get into the work you're doing, as I said, and why it's relevant to emerging biopharmas. But first, I want to get to know you a little bit better and let our audience get to know you a little bit better. So, as I mentioned, your undergrad at Yale. I don't think I mentioned it was in poli-sci and international relations. And then you earned a Wharton MBA in healthcare marketing. You've been in the life science industry ever since. What sort of motivated the gravitation to this industry from that poli-sci undergrad? I know we're going back a little ways, but what was the motivation to kind of jump into healthcare from there?
So, I mean, I come from a family of doctors, so healthcare has kind of been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And, some of my initial thoughts around kind of the business side of healthcare honestly started when I was in high school, watching my dad, who's a neurologist and a movement disorders specialist, now retired, work on some of the first deep brain stimulation implants that were being done in the 90s. And I saw firsthand through some video clips of, patients that basically couldn't move, couldn't walk when they went on the operating table and get up and walk off the table, and just seeing the incredible potential of that kind of therapy to directly and immediately, in that case, change patient outcomes and patients' lives was something that was just incredibly motivating and inspiring to me. So I've always really been passionate about a career in the healthcare sector. I was, in addition to being a poli-sci major, I was pre-med. We just didn't have that as a major choice when I was at Yale, but I took all the pre-med requirements, I think, except one term of physics, which I put to the side. But somewhere around my senior year, decided that I'd like to stay on kind of the policy and business side of the healthcare sector, and ended up joining McKinsey and serving a number of healthcare clients there. And then, also spent some time working before I went back and did an MBA in the healthcare provider sector. So worked for a big, the parent company of the Mass General and the Brigham and Women hospitals in Boston, serving patients and actually representing those groups in negotiations with insurance companies. So I've seen healthcare from a lot of different vantage points over the course of my career. And it's just been really fascinating to learn about the different complex aspects of our healthcare system in this country and also abroad. And I feel like I'm able to apply that to the VC work that I've been doing for the last decade or so.
Yeah. And where did that work? So the VC angle, where did that kind of come into play? What was your, initial interest in going on the venture capital path?
It's funny. I mean, when I was in business school, I think I had a lot of classmates who had very clearly in their sights to go into VC. And honestly, at that point in time, it just didn't even cross my mind. It didn't hit my radar screen. I wanted to go and market and sell healthcare products. I wanted to take my experience from the hospital side and bring kind of innovations and new therapies to patients and to clinicians. And so I ended up joining Medtronic in post MBA in a rotational program, which allowed me to work both in the US and then move overseas to Europe. And I worked in business development functions, again, looking at new technologies and kind of thinking about those build versus buy decisions. And then when I moved over to Europe, I was living in Switzerland for the company, working in the interventional cardiology franchise and launching products, selling directly to customers. But I also had the opportunity to get involved in a joint venture between Medtronic and a couple of venture firms, including Sofinnova Partners and Versant, called MD Start. It was a medical device incubator. And, just getting exposure to the innovation side again of the healthcare sector through that work and exposure to kind of more of the day-to-day of the venture side was really interesting. And, at that time I was selling cardiac stents to clinicians across Europe, which is an exciting space, but it's also a little bit like selling toothpaste. All the major brands are very good quality. And so, I felt like I'd gotten a little bit further away from some of the innovation side and the really kind of breakthrough opportunities. Now, I'm sure my Medtronic colleagues who are there and others in the sector would probably take issue with that. So I'm the last one to say those aren't very innovative products, but just from a day-to-day, I was ready for something that was more on the earlier end of things.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. And since 2018, you've been with the JDRF T1D Fund, and I want to dig into that a little bit because when you and I spoke for the first time, you provided me a bit of an education on how a venture philanthropy fund, what it is and how it works, and that's what this is. That's what you're doing. So let's start there, just for those of us in the audience who are unfamiliar with that VC fund approach. Tell us what it is and how it works, and then we'll talk maybe some more specifically about what's going on at JDRF T1D Fund.
Yeah, terrific. I mean, so just to rewind for 1 second and then to jump into that, I think following my time in operating roles in the healthcare industry, really learning the day-to-day of venture at Sofinnova and then later at Endeavor Vision and working with a number of venture groups across the US and Europe, I think, I really came to understand how it's this community of investors and entrepreneurs working together that can make these accelerating changes to patients' healthcare in a real way. And the critical part of the ecosystem that segment plays, I think, in accelerating therapies from this nascent stage to the clinic. And so, in a way, my mission orientation towards bringing therapies to patients has been there for me since the beginning of my career. And so,
let me just interrupt you there real quick. Like when you were working in a more traditional VC environment, was that missing for you? I guess that more direct link, obviously when we think about venture capital, when we think about investments in any industry, right, in any business community, I guess the primary motivating factor is return on investment, picking winning horses, that kind of thing. But in this is not necessarily, that obviously that's tied to commercial success, that's tied to market success. But in this industry, there's a lot that goes on between the investment, in the time frame between the investment and that market or commercial payback. So I'm just asking, I guess the core of the question is, what was that kind of direct link missing for you? Because I think that plays in a little bit to this model that you're working in now.
I'm not sure I felt like it was missing, but I definitely feel like it's much more front and center in what I do day to day now, because it's explicit in what the role of the T1D Fund is doing, where we put the mission impact as the first lens and then the financial kind of business dealing impact as the additional lens. And I'll get into why that's so important for our model in a few minutes. But no, I would say it was more that, look, in the medtech side of things, you don't have to wait quite as long for innovations to make it to patients. I think on the pharma side, as you referenced, in the biotech space, a lot of money can be made well before you ever find out if a therapy has real clinical benefit. And so some of those mission and business linkages are a little bit less connected than maybe they are in businesses that get to the clinic or get to patients sooner. But I don't think I realized it. I mean, I didn't feel it was missing, but I think now it's just such a core piece of what we do. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about the fund model and how it's kind of different from regular venture, and also maybe how our model within that is a little bit unique, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. And I guess I posed that kind of convoluted question to you about whether or not that felt like it was missing back then versus today, because I think as a product of the unique mechanism of your fund, you strike me as an advocate, and I think there's a fair amount of advocacy involved in the VC model that you work in now. So like you strike me as an advocate for type 1 diabetes research and curative therapies. And I'll stop talking and let you explain. But I think as we kind of get into this model, it'll become clear why that advocacy is such an important element of what you're doing.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think, it's a real pleasure to be able to do both things, I would say, at least for me personally, to be able to be sort of this vehicle and for our team to represent the interests of the T1D community and hopefully accelerating these therapies to help them and their loved ones, the caretakers of people with type 1. And at the same time, to do that in a mechanism that's very much hand in hand with how the regular venture industry works for developing these drugs and therapies. So it feels like we've kind of hit on a model, which again, the founders of the fund, I think, took some time to analyze and understand what would be the ways to drive that in a very smart way. And I think we're now finding that's working. So maybe just to take a step back, one thing that's different about how our fund is set up is that it is a not-for-profit. And again, venture philanthropy or impact investing models can come in a few different shapes and flavors. And so what I'll describe is how we do it at the T1D Fund, which I'm a little biased, but I would say we do it in what I consider to be a pretty pure way. So as I said, we're a not-for-profit fund, which means that we don't raise capital from investors to give it back to them, but rather we raise capital from donors who expect a mission return on their donation, their investment, not a financial return. And so as a result of that, any proceeds that we make from our equity investments in venture-backed startups goes back into the fund coffers for redeployment in other areas that can help move therapies to patients over time. And, that's, our goal ultimately is to bring cures to people with type 1 diabetes and to change their lives. And as you mentioned at the beginning, it's a disease where even 100 years now after the discovery of insulin, we have no disease-modifying therapies for the 1.6 million people in the US and the almost 20 million people worldwide who are living with T1D, not to mention the millions more who are at risk of the disease because of their genetic predisposition and other factors in their biology. So, we view this as a long-term thing, our desire to bring these therapies forward. And so we felt that a model of a donation-based, not-for-profit evergreen type of structure where we don't have to return capital after 10 years as you would in a typical fund was the right setup for achieving these long-term goals and outcomes of the foundation, which is to bring these answers to patients. So, for us, we can be patient when we make an investment in a company. We don't have like a ticking clock for our own purposes in terms of how soon that return needs to be generated. However, we're also very aware of the fact that the for-profit investors who are investing alongside us do have those. So in a way, it's kind of a moot point other than we personally aren't the ones driving those maybe time-based decisions for the company. We can, work with the company to make sure that the science is progressing in the best way forward and have impact on the mission. I would say the other purpose is that we're really working to accelerate cures. And as a result of that, we're maybe approaching our model a little differently than some of the other disease-focused investment vehicles that you might have come across. And again, there's no right or wrong. It's just the way that our fund was set up. So we are not set up as a fundraising vehicle for other things that the foundation is doing. And JDRF is a foundation that's been around serving the needs of people with type 1 diabetes for 50 years. They do a lot of great things in this space. They fund academic research. They do lobbying on Capitol Hill and across other countries as well. They're fostering the T1D community. They're supporting parents, but the fund is really all about accelerating these venture-backed therapies and getting them to the clinic as fast as possible. And so when we raise capital, it's only for that. And when we get the capital back, we keep it for that. And we let the fundraising activities of the foundation for those other things happen kind of on the side with its own support and its own team. So that's something that's a little bit different about our model as well. And then I guess I would say lastly, we talked about this a little bit before. For us at the T1D Fund, the mission is the first lens always when we're evaluating new opportunities and new deals. And we consider, what is the potential for this technology, this therapy to dramatically change the lives of people with this disease. And then if that's a check, then we kind of move to all the other regular attributes that any VC in the for-profit sector would think about, the deal, the team, the technology, the syndicate, et cetera, the market dynamics. And again, that's kind of getting back to the idea that if our opportunities that we care about from curing the disease aren't going to check all those boxes, then we're never going to be able to raise the amount of capital to get those therapies to the clinic. And so our for-profit colleagues have to be, aligned on why this particular opportunity is worth their time.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. You just, you're an easy interview. I ask one question and you unpack like several.
If it's too long, then I'm happy to break it up.
No, that's great. Cause I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions that dig into some of what you just talked about and really help our audience understand just how the fund works from a mechanical kind of day-to-day standpoint. But before we do that, I want to get a sense for, the last time you and I spoke, we talked about the fact, again, you educated me on the notion that for a long time, this has been an underfunded endeavor. The VC activity in this space hasn't been active, right? It hasn't been necessarily a sexy indication for VC funding. Why is that? I mean, I'm interested in why that is. I'm always interested in these conversations around. We talked about the prevalence, the impact of the disease. In a very simple economic model, that's a giant opportunity. Why haven't we addressed it in an aggressive manner from a funding standpoint to date?
Yeah, I'd say there's a few drivers of that, right? And those drivers are obviously evolving as the landscape around us changes. But there still is, believe it or not, a lot of confusion between type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes. And that's like even sadly among some clinicians and a lot of people who are in the care of general practitioners. Their general practitioners actually don't really totally understand the difference between type 1 and type 2. And so that's, even more amplified in the investment community, even some of the groups that are, I would say, relatively sophisticated, healthcare investors. So there's an education that needs to happen in terms of, differentiating type 1 from type 2. And when you look at type 1, in contrast to the type 2 market, it looks small, right? And so, we're also trying to reframe that lens to say, okay, but as you said, if you put it in the context of the autoimmune landscape, it's one of the largest autoimmune diseases that has no disease modifying therapy. So clearly, if you solve this, there's, a prize at the end for whomever is able to solve this. I think the other thing which you brought up earlier is that there's a belief that insulin is a cure. And, for anyone living with type 1 diabetes, clearly having insulin therapy is completely life-saving. It's life-changing. And there's been a ton of progress made in how patients are able to access insulin therapy through new technologies, better insulins. And there's been a lot of progress, but it's absolutely not a cure. I mean, this is an incredibly high burden disease. Patients think about their blood glucose levels, what they're eating, how they're exercising, what's going to happen when they go to sleep. I'd say multiple times per hour at the minimum. And, some of what we're looking for, right, is even with these advances in new technology and therapies is the idea that a person with diabetes could have a pump that does some of the decision-making for them and maybe doesn't have to think about it every 5 minutes, but it's actually a few times a day. But even that is a lot. It's a lot. There's a lot of decisions and a lot of mental burden that comes along with that, in addition to the fear around both the short-term consequences that can be dire, and then, of course, the long-term consequences of bad glucose control, which lead to a lot of complications that are, of course, in common with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So I think, there's this misperception around insulin is good enough. And then there's also the reality of the fact that insulin therapy is available, and therefore the safety risk-benefit trade-offs for new disease-modifying therapies have to stack up on top of insulin therapy. And that's different than being in oncology when somebody has a more limited window. I mean, people with diabetes are able to live long lives and do a lot of things. So there's it's a double-edged sword. I guess I'd say the last kind of bucket for why we feel there hasn't been as much investment in this space is T1D. It is a complex disease, and there have been attempts, along the way and over the last decades to try to bring novel disease-modifying therapy approaches to this disease, which involves an overzealous activation of your immune system, which is causing destruction of your pancreas and also leads to these severe metabolic outcomes. The pharma industry has been working on this for a long time, but there's failed attempts along the way. There are things that got to later stages in the clinic. And so there's some scar tissue around how hard this is. And so I'd say we feel we're in a resurgence of attention because of the new biology and the new techniques and approaches that are being applied across the life sciences sector. But that's something we have to overcome.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Yeah. And that's a great segue into my next question, because looking at your, you mentioned the progress that's being made in the biology and the technology to address T1D. If you look at your portfolio, your investment portfolio, it strikes me that it's robust. I mean, you've got quite a few companies there, and quite a few of them are biologics companies, which is encouraging to see. And I'm hoping you can tell us what you're seeing, in terms of, and maybe this will help you sort of illustrate a little bit about who and what you choose as well. Because I'm wondering what you're seeing in the biologic therapy, I guess the greater biologic therapy landscape in terms of development toward the mission of JDRF and its T1D fund.
Yeah, I mean, so we are modality agnostic, I would say, as a first comment. We'll invest in disease-modifying therapies for type 1 diabetes, whether they're small molecules or biologics or, whatever else there is. So, however, as you said, a lot of the opportunities, especially the ones that are kind of coming to the fore now, are in the biologics space. And obviously that's a broad category. So there's a lot to choose from there. But, I think we definitely see that there's an explosion of science in this area, and a lot of it comes back to biologic modulation. And so maybe I'll just kind of highlight some of the ways that we've invested in this space. And it's really hard to pick a few to talk about, because I think we have so many great companies in our portfolio. We're now having made investments in 29 companies over the last 5 years. It's I hope no one gets offended if I don't mention their approach, but maybe just
no, not at all. I don't put real hard guardrails on our time constraint. We've got a lot of time. We probably don't have that much.
So you want to do all 29? It's perfect. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the ones that's like really kind of a great poster child for our fund, but also I think will illustrate the question you asked, is our investment that was in Pandion Therapeutics, which was an autoimmune platform developing bispecific antibody therapies for tissue targeting. And, while Pandion's lead program was ultimately in ulcerative colitis and IBD, our team had discussions with the management of the company not that far after its founding and their investors to talk about how their platform could be used to deliver immunomodulators to the pancreas using that tissue-specific targeting approach, because getting, the payload to the tissue of interest, minimizing side effects in other tissues, is obviously something that's really important for many diseases, including, of course, type 1 diabetes, where you do want to kind of regulate the awry immune system in that tissue without creating problems for regular, immunoactivity if you have exposure to viruses, et cetera. So, that's something where we had conversations with the team and found that there was really great promise for their technology to be applied to the T1D ecosystem and could really help maybe delay or prevent disease progression in T1D populations. So again, that's sort of the immune side of the coin for how we think about approaching the disease. And, ultimately our investment in the Pandion group helped catalyze their pancreas program, which was, something that started off with a relatively small investment. They were able to staff that program better. It had been an idea, but not a funded program before. And then eventually, as they made really good progress in the science, it caught the attention of Astellas, which is a pharmaceutical company that hadn't previously invested in type 1 diabetes, and ended up signing a collaboration with Astellas to work on several pancreas, programs, essentially, which now kind of live on to this day, even after Pandion IPO'd and then was acquired by Merck. The Astellas relationship with those original assets is continuing and hopefully making progress towards the clinic. So, for us, that's an area that's very interesting, is how do you deliver therapies to the pancreas in a targeted way? And, we have a lot of ideas about payloads and other things to deliver, but having the technology to do that is one thing. So that's kind of one side of the coin, I guess I would say. Another area that we're very interested in is, of course, the very exciting cell and gene therapy space today. And, you could do probably a whole podcast on either one of those in T1D alone. So I'll try to.
I'll take you up. I'll take you up on that. We'll do that another time.
Well, for that one, I'll call our PhD teammates because I think they'll do a better job of going much deeper than what I'm going to do here. It's always fun to be working, and as I said at the beginning, in the life sciences space and in healthcare, it's a true passion of mine. However, as you noted, I did not take the route of working in the lab and getting my PhD or MD. So I'm very grateful for my colleagues who have that background and who help us do a great job in picking the right investments and also supporting our teams. But on the cell and gene therapy space, I'd highlight one, which is on the cell therapy side, that has been in the news a little bit recently. So maybe I'll just unpack the T1D piece of that more, which is an investment the fund made earlier in its life in Sema Therapeutics. Mm-hmm. So Sema was acquired about 2.5 years ago by Vertex. It was nearly $1 billion acquisition for preclinical stage beta cell replacement therapy that was based on stem cell derived beta cells, and coming out of Doug Melton's work at Harvard. And, Sema is a part of an exciting and growing group of cell therapy companies that are working on developing these stem cell derived or iPSC derived islets that can be transplanted in people with type 1 diabetes who have fully lost their ability to make insulin and rely exclusively on exogenous insulin. And, those cells can act as a new source of insulin producing cells to, reduce, or really in the best case, eliminate the need for insulin injections and insulin therapy for these patients, which has knock-on effects, of course, to reduce the long-term complications of diabetes that can be quite dramatic. And so, recently in the last few weeks, Vertex announced the highly anticipated but highly promising results of the first patient that they're treating with the Sema product, which paves the way for more enthusiasm, capital, and innovation, I think, to come into that segment. And we've certainly, as a fund, taken a good look and continue to make new investments in this beta cell replacement space, looking at next generation technologies, other modalities, and ways to improve upon, these first therapies coming to the clinic. So, it's a very small slice of the cell and gene therapy pool, but it's one which is getting a lot of attention right now because of this first patient who's essentially, after 3 months of receiving this transplant, under an immunosuppressive regimen. So that's one of the drawbacks for the early therapy, is essentially almost entirely off exogenous insulin, which, he'd lived with T1D and had been on insulin therapy for 40 years. So it's a pretty dramatic step forward. And of course, we'll wait for more than the first patient, hopefully, to have more confidence there.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about the work you guys are doing and how you're doing it is, as I think I used the word aggressive in the preamble, whereby a lot of VC firms might take more of an inbound approach. Sure, they may have, specific indications or, specific niche areas where they're focused, but they take more of an inbound approach to being pitched. Whereas you guys, you're not just enabling, I think I would choose the word instigating. Like you can cite examples of where, correct me if I'm wrong here, but where the fund has gone into a newer emerging biotech company and said, you don't have a candidate in your pipeline or maybe even in development that is expressly directed at type 1 diabetes, but we think you could. And if you do, we will support you with money and intelligence and, an oversight committee and on and on. Am I right? Like, did I get that right? So that's awesome. I mean, it's unique, it's aggressive, it's awesome.
I would just say it's one of the really fun things I think about working for this fund and in this space is that kind of new set of muscles essentially that we get to use to generate deal flow, essentially. I mean, to put it in that form, I think, while we're absolutely motivated to take a look at companies who have already declared their allegiance to the T1D fight and are working diligently for T1D as a first indication or an only indication. And that's certainly, always of interest to us because those teams have already kind of made their commitment. I think, we definitely have had a goal to expand the universe of those opportunities and to leverage the really amazing science and talent across the life sciences industry and kind of bring it to T1D because, the JDRF has been around for 50 years doing great work and funding early and some later stage research, but we definitely don't have a cure yet. So we need to use different ways of creating that science and pushing it towards the disease that we care about. And so, as you said, we really do look for proactive opportunities to make that happen, where we think the science and the biology is relevant and where we can work closely with teams. Now, it's not always that they never thought about T1D or that they haven't even done some early scientific exploration in that area. Again, T1D is one of these diseases that is pretty well understood and people have been working on it on the research side for many years. So the chances that somebody earlier in their scientific training went through someone's lab and did some T1D NOD mouse experiments is not that low. So we often find friendly audiences to talk about how the mechanisms that the teams are working on could apply to type 1 diabetes. But, we reach out to teams directly or through their VC investors and our friends and walk them through the process of talking about a T1D indication, whether they've thought about that or not. And then, kind of hand in hand, work with them to figure out what that would look like, what would a program look like to develop that into a real pipeline product, and then try to support them along the way. So we are very proactive in finding those. We're proactive during the diligence process and kind of partnering with a company. And then, of course, post-investment, as you mentioned, we do set up kind of more formal structures, although I don't want to scare people off with that. I'd say formal in the sense that we have an active working group, what we call a program advisory committee with almost all of our portfolio companies to really kind of block and tackle and give advice and be a sounding board for their T1D therapy. But it's really like a free consulting service. It's not something where they then have to do what we say. It's really just an opportunity to dialogue and to get into the data. But what I would say is like the teams do have to make a commitment that they are going to work on a T1D indication if we come in financially into the company. So, they may need a little persuading at the beginning, but certainly, for us to come in and kind of play that role, they need to be ready and their investors need to be really ready to deploy talent and capital to the indication.
Yeah, very cool. What do you look for, beyond the scientific chops, I guess? What do you look for in terms of the cultural or, maturity level, if you will, I guess longevity of a company? What are some of the attributes you look for in a company that you might be interested in supporting?
I mean, I don't think it's that different, honestly, from what I did in my prior venture life. And we do talk about this as a team. I think when the fund first got started, there was maybe some, consideration of whether this is like capital of last resort for people who've tried to raise money from other VCs and can't. And I think there's lots of reasons why we don't want to be that, and we don't feel we are that. I think, it's not a gap financing vehicle. We are coming in with other regular way for-profit investors in a syndicate, ideally at the same time, although we can be a little flexible around that. If it's going to start a T1D program earlier, we can sometimes come in off cycle, but really we're there to invest alongside regular way investors to make sure that the T1D programs get their fair share of the capital that's, flowing around this industry right now. So, we look for the same things that I think all investors look for. We look for motivated and talented scientific and management teams. We look for sophisticated and supportive investors who can go the distance. And we can also go the distance. We make investments in our first point, and then we follow until the company doesn't need the support anymore. And again, we have the flexibility to do that because we've now raised, we're close to a $200 million fund. We've returned a bunch of capital, kind of redeployed that into our coffers. And so we have the flexibility to invest where we need to support that next step for a company. So, in a lot of ways, I think sometimes if you're not paying attention, my day job looks very similar to what it looks like in another venture capital firm. It's just that we talk a lot about diabetes in our team. So I think we're really looking for exceptional science in that space. And then we also spend a lot of time thinking about, is this team one that we can work collaboratively with to develop this program and where we feel we can add real value, not just economic value, of course, but support access to KOLs in the space, facilitating discussions with other researchers or tissue banks, et cetera, talking about clinical strategy and trial design that are specific to this disease that doesn't have any cures approved yet. And so if we don't feel like we're going to be able to do those value-added pieces, then, it's maybe not a great fit for us to come in either.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked a bit about the giant market opportunity. We talked about some of the drivers that, might interest an emerging or startup biopharma in pursuing T1D as an indication. If you're speaking directly to the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies, what else is there? I want to ask a two-part question. What else is there sort of on the why side? Why should I consider type 1 diabetes as an indication? And then maybe a bit on the how, as a leader of a new emerging biopharma company, if I wanted to get involved in a fund like T1D, or, even if I'm working in a different indication, but there are opportunities similar to the T1D fund in that indication or in that disease area, the how about going about working with a fund like yours. So that's a lot of words, but I hope you follow it. Yeah, with the why and the how. Speaking directly to the biopharma leader.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, that's a long question. I think I'll try to tackle that. I mean, I think, the why, I think we've covered a lot already in the discussion, where I think, as you said, it is a market that's a large market and it has clear unmet need. And that's something which I think is recognized if you look at the medical community and the clinicians taking care of patients, and clearly by the patient community, which JDRF represents directly. There was an advisory board for teplizumab, which is an immunomodulator for T1D that was held over the summer. And the great news is that from the clinical community, there was just no question ultimately that even delaying disease onset by 2 years has dramatic value to patients and their families. And I think that's something which is one thing, kind of the motivating thrust behind being able to bring one of the first disease modifying therapies to this group of patients who've been waiting impatiently, I would say patiently, but not for the last, 100 years. So, I mean, clearly there's the motivating factor there. There's the size of the market. And I think ultimately, the ability to be at the right time in the right place. As we talked about, there's an explosion in terms of understanding of immunology, in terms of new tools and techniques that are coming into the field now across a number of different diseases. And we feel like T1D is definitely poised to benefit from those advances in cell and gene therapy as much, if not more, than other diseases today. I think, we didn't talk too much about it, but one of the areas that we're extremely excited about is not just halting the progression of disease or stalling it in its tracks or delaying it, but also reversing it, and not just through transplants. There's opportunities to proliferate beta cell mass, to turn other cells into insulin producing cells, which could alleviate the need for exogenous insulin. And the advances that are being made in the cell and gene therapy space across those modalities has huge power for patients in this space, and unlocks really new approaches to curing the disease. So that allows you to address not just patients who have newly been diagnosed where there's still beta cells left to save, but also the population of people who've been living with the disease for a long time, and think about regenerating new beta cell mass in a very exciting and disease modifying way. So I think there's that. And then there's the fact that we feel like through our fund and the relationship we have, thanks to the JDRF community, to the broader type 1 diabetes ecosystem, whether it's the regulators who are in regular communication with our advocacy and government affairs staff, the clinician community who are running these clinical trials and a part of these clinical trial networks in the US and internationally, certainly the scientific access to research in the space, because the T1D Fund is, reliant heavily on the discussions with our partners in the JDRF research team, who are the grant makers that get all these applications for grants every year. So I think we feel like we're going to be able to help de-risk a program in T1D with access to all of that expertise and resources in a way that will help you as a company really maximize the potential of your program and maximize the benefit to your shareholders. So we feel like it's a good model, and it's the right time to be applying this model.
Yeah, very good. That's very instructional. Yeah, we're running short on time here, Katie, but just one last question. What's the next big step for you and for the T1D Fund? Like what's on your immediate horizon that you're excited about or concerned about? What's kind of coming down the pike?
Yeah, I think, listen, we're thrilled to have been able to make, nearly 30 investments in the 5 years of the fund's life. It's been, a lot of activity and a flurry of kind of getting new companies into the portfolio. And we'll continue to do that. As we said, we're funded to be able to make new investments every year and to support those companies. But as we now kind of look at the stock of companies that we have, and again, we tend to invest in things that are earlier in the preclinical stage, then it's going to be about really moving them, towards the clinic. And so, the good news is that a number of our companies are now working on therapies where the science is playing out to the point where they're getting ready to enter the clinic soon or already doing first studies. But this is uncharted territory from a clinical and regulatory standpoint. Again, there's no roadmap to follow where the disease modifying therapy has already been approved and you can just repeat that trial and, check the box. This is something that is developing real time. And so we think that we're very committed to work with our portfolio companies and their teams to navigate that process, to bring the right level of expertise, but also the pressure on the regulatory community to do that in the right way, to weigh those risk benefits. But, clearly we're entering into the real proof phase here of, can we get these things, through those clinical trials and into the hands of patients? And so we've got a lot of work ahead of us to focus on that and to build up the skills and the team around the portfolio companies and our staff to get that advice and to make it operational.
Yeah. I look forward to following along. It's an exciting sort of inflection point for the fund and for the space, for the indication. The community of patients who live with type 1 diabetes that are so hopeful, that these things will come to fruition. So we'll be following along. And I really appreciate you coming on to share the story with us and to talk a little bit about how our audience, might be involved or might get involved in the effort. You're excellent guest. Like I said, even my convoluted questions, you addressed very, very, very graciously.
No, with pleasure. It was fun to have the conversation. And I think, we're big believers that the voice of the patients can be a huge driver of bringing these therapies to the clinic and advocating on behalf of companies and, helping make that possible. And certainly we're really encouraged to see as well that there's a number of other disease-focused philanthropic groups who are working on similar models to the T1D Fund. So I would just encourage your listeners, if you come across one of those venture philanthropies in a different disease and something you're working on, really take that conversation seriously. Ask them how they can support you. Ask them, what they can bring to bear beyond just the capital, because it's really, for us, it's not that the capital isn't important, but I think, we really measure our success by being able to motivate other private capital to the point where we've now put in about $70 million into our portfolio, but that's been matched alongside with over $500 million plus of private capital coming in just on the T1D related work that we're doing. So, there's an opportunity for you to work with these disease-oriented groups and really accelerate your path towards, having approved therapies.
Yeah, I like it. Well, thanks again, Katie. Thanks so much for coming on. Look forward to, like I said, following the story, and perhaps when more progress is made and there's more to talk about, we'll have you back on the show to share some updates.
With pleasure.
So that's the JDRF T1D Fund's Katie Ellias. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online with the generous support of Cytiva, which demonstrates its commitment to new and emerging biopharma companies at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Check that out. Check us out at bioprocessonline.com, where you can subscribe to my newsletter. And if you like this podcast and what we're talking about on it, please subscribe, give us 5 stars, and thanks for listening.